So let me tell you who's sitting up here. Siddharth is a very close friend. Siddharth is author, activist, and he's known as one of the world's foremost researchers, but also spokespeople on human trafficking. His first book was Sex Trafficking Inside the Business of Modern Slavery, and then more recently, Bonded Labor, tackling the system of slavery in South Asia. So he's had a very broad view of what we mean when we talk about modern slavery. He's now at the Kennedy School of Government as well as the Harvard School of Public Health in various roles. Diane Rosenfeld, I have known for too long, and a long time. Too long in terms of I'm aging, that's what I was thinking. Anyway, Diane's at the law school, and she has really introduced me a lot to the law school world here, bringing me into her class. She is the lecturer on law and director of law and director, that can't be right.
The Gender Violence Program.
Yes, right. Okay, forget that. She is the director of the Gender Violence Program here at the school, and her course is Gender Violence Law and Social Justice, and also Title IX, and also Theories of Sexual Coercion. She brings her students into really cutting-edge policy work. And I was so struck, I remember when there were the big gang rape case in India, and Diane is the person who's being brought in, how do we write these laws to address this so India can move off of their terrible policies there. She's really renowned. And so how we end up with you sitting next to Siddharth Kaur is just amazing to me, to have the expertise. But there's no one like Sherry Jimenez in terms of expertise. She has lived it. If you want to know the real deal, you've got to have Sherry here sitting among us to tell us what life is like from the inside of this industry. But also, I'd like very much, I hope that you'll be able to talk not just for yourself, but so many of the girls and women with whom you work. I think it's really, really important to have your voice. And Sherry is someone who got into this, the life in terms of supporting your family, et cetera. So I hope that you'll give us a sense of that as well. Orlando Patterson, I remember when students started whispering to me, I'm at the Kennedy School, oh, did you hear? Orlando Patterson is putting together a course. And it was like a big, big deal. And thank you for inviting me to come and lecture in your course. Orlando Patterson, as you know, is one of the top people worldwide on the issue of slavery in general, and then for him to then call this industry by the name of modern day slavery gives it a gravitas that is extraordinary. So thank you. And you and I talked in your office about how hard it was to decide, where does a person's right to buy stop with the damage that they're doing? How do you calculate that? That's something law school students are trying to figure out all the time. Where do rights of one person end in order for the rights of another to begin? So you've been leading hundreds of students now through that question. Now, I'm not going to do what you think. We're not going to have a panel. I know they look like a panel, but they're not a panel. They are sitting around Thanksgiving table at their different homes, and somebody says to them what people say to you at your Thanksgiving table, and you get your eyes roll, and you think, oh God, here we go again. Someone says to you, so what are you working on these days? You think, oh, no one around this table is going to understand anything I say. And I know, see? It's absolutely true. Well, you're not alone, right? Because I thought of it, right? Which means I've had that experience all the time, right? And you have too, right? So we all have that sinking feeling. So tonight you're practicing, And so I'd like for us to really all be in that conversation around the Thanksgiving table when somebody says, so what are you thinking about these days? Or what are you working on? And And I remember I was 6 years into my doctoral dissertation, and my uncle, my mother's very close brother, didn't know I was doing a doctorate, right? So because they didn't know how to talk about it. They didn't, they're raised on farms, and I mean, so every one of you has your version of that. Okay, so that's what's happening. We're sitting around and having a conversation, and I'm not really structuring it at all. I'm really doing my part right now. Except that at some point, I will say, hey, would one of you like to join in? And I hope that one of you will say, yes, I have a thought, I have a question, I have a comment on what somebody else says. Would you go further than you have, or whatever, okay? And so I didn't tell you all that, but you're having the conversation really with everyone, all right? So that's it. So Siddharth, honey, I'm your second cousin. I'm your second cousin, Swanee. I mean, I know we don't know each other very well, but your mother knew I didn't have any place to go for Thanksgiving, and I work at the Boston Globe, printing papers, and but I've heard your name, Siddharth, and so what is it exactly you do?
What do I do? Does working on Inner Peace count?
No.
No, okay.
Inner Peace.
I have been preoccupied with researching various forms of contemporary slavery and forced labor and child labor and human trafficking for the last 15 years or so. This journey started for me actually in a refugee camp in the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s. I wasn't a refugee, I was volunteering in the camp. And I heard stories of things that I frankly at the time didn't really understand. Rape camps and trafficking of women and girls, Bosnians, into brothels and such across the region. That was a summer experience I had that sort of always stuck with me, and I kind of went on a winding journey of getting an MBA and a law degree and working in investment banking, but I had always been very haunted by that particular summer. And come the late 90s, I started to look around to see, are these things still happening? And if so, is anyone doing anything about it? And I saw a few anecdotal reports, nothing that seemed terribly satisfying in terms of really digging into the issues. So to make a long story short, I sort of jettisoned one path and embarked on, in the summer of 2000, what was to become the first of many research trips going around the world. I did focus initially on trafficking for forced prostitution and commercial sexual exploitation all over the world, and that was the subject of my first book, as you mentioned, and expanded into other forms of slavery, labor trafficking, debt bondage, child labor in general, and have been most recently preoccupied with looking at global supply chains, slavery and child labor and global supply chains, but have throughout all the years now, 15 years, continued to gather information and data and narrative to try to understand sex trafficking. And I'll just round out by saying my initial thinking on this issue was demand-oriented. I saw the supply side and the intractable forces there that need to be addressed, and I thought maybe there's weakness on the demand side. And initially I was looking very economically at how do we...
Yeah, I don't get what you mean. I don't get what you mean about demand.
You don't understand demand?
No.
So those who express a demand for either the profiteering associated with forced prostitution and commercial sexual exploitation of women and children, or the consumer who is purchasing that commercial sexual transaction. And I initially thought very economically about this and ultimately started to shift my thinking to more what we'd call consumption demand, that consumer who's expressing demand for something he'd like to purchase, and looking at that as a very vulnerable point of potential intervention. And I know that's been a focus of your work, though you suggest you don't know much about it. And I'll stop there, but that's sort of what I've been up to.
And you brought Sherry, is that right, with you? to Thanksgiving?
She was wandering, the street, and I thought, please come with me. My much lighter skinned second cousin is going to be with us. So you have to meet her.
Okay. Well, I have to say this, if we're going to be real here, and I'm, being brought to this wonderful Thanksgiving dinner, and you asked me, what am I working on? And I said something very personal, because this is an issue that is personal to me because I used to be in the sex trade. Everybody would change the conversation, probably.
Yeah.
Or leave. So I just want to put that out there. It's for where I sit. It's a tough, it's a difficult discussion, okay, with friends and relatives. But what I've been working on is trying to create a way out for women, because I know how hard it was for me. So I've been doing this exit program here in Boston for about 10 years. And over these 10 years, and like Swanee said, I met hundreds of women, listened to their stories, got to know them while, giving them the resources and tools to create better options for themselves. So it's their stories and what's going on here in Boston that I'm working on, and what we're trying to do too is really build a comprehensive program and housing program, because people don't understand this in a lot of our US cities. 90% of the women that I work with really come from our own communities here. 70% come out of systems. And what are systems? DCF systems. No viable skill, no ill-equipped for the world.
So this is like foster care?
Foster care, and not even foster care, residential. So that really, when you say foster care, means you come out of some semblance of family.
Right, right.
So these young people I meet come out of residential. That means they've grown up in these environments of sort of like being in a jailhouse setting with no love, no caring.
So they got put into they were taken from their families and put in because of sexual abuse or neglect or
So taken out, yes, early on, usually for a variety of reasons. And because of the trauma and the exposure to violence that they've had, they would go into foster care initially.
Got it.
Okay? But a lot of women would tell me, well, I bombed out of foster care, mostly because of their behavior, because of who they are and what's happened to them. And then they would be placed in residential.
Got it.
Okay? That's the tragedy here, and this is something that I find really disgraceful in our own communities, because these young women with such potential, but limited access to opportunity because of their life circumstances, are rendered to the sex trade. And I'm saying, and I know I was in this industry, this industry has exploded due to many reasons. The internet, technology, normalization of prostitution. So we have a lot of things to work on here. But I want people to walk away today and understand that we have a real problem within our own community here. Because sometimes people see this as something, and it plays out in different ways all across the world. But here, we have a overrepresentation of young people that have had the most horrendous violence in their life, but marginalized, not given opportunity, not underfunded schools. I could name 10 things that they're reasons for getting into this. And we need to get to the root problems. Of course, we need to focus on demand. This is what fuels this industry. But we really, in this country, have to address this gender inequality, this growing marginalization of young people growing up ill-equipped and growing up badly. So that's what I would say on our Thanksgiving dinner, okay?
Now the Globe, I remember I was on a coffee break, and I read this op-ed in the Globe, and it was by Shawnee Swami Hunt.
Yeah. She's great. Do you know about her? Do you know anything about her?
No, she just has a weird name.
She's changed the world for women and girls, and she's just a trailblazer who's great at bringing people together to have
This was
conversations.
scripted, this part was. Okay, so anyway, in it, she said that trafficking now is defined by the FBI and the UN as any person under 18 and anyone who is the victim of force, fraud, or coercion. And she also said that the age in which, in the US, females, if you will, women or girls, start in being sold is 15 is the average age. If you're a girl, it's much younger. It's 12, 13, 14 if you take just the girls. Now, I don't know if the numbers hold perfectly here. I mean, you all can tell me. But I had thought that trafficking was bringing Nigerian women into Florida or something. But it sounds like it actually is something that can happen right here from one home in Boston to another home on the next street. Is that right?
Well, there's a legal definition of trafficking, which is, and I always use the words force, fraud, and coercion.
Right.
But understand this, though, because sometimes people see this as a simplistic thing. There's trafficking, and then there's that other, right? Like, and I'm saying this because I've been on the front lines. It's messy. It's intertwined. It's not so clearly defined like that. And even young women I meet, they might fit that definition, but that's not their language. It's complicated. And so also think about this. It's not, and we have a tendency when we think about, oh, trafficking, that's someone so clearly forced. Yes, but it doesn't always play out so simple like that. And I think we really need to understand this, because if we don't understand it, we can't fix it. And so there's not two, like, oh, there's that, trafficking and she was forced, and then there's that other, that's that prostitution. We don't want to take a stand on that. That's, let women do what they want with their bodies. No. Well, you can't address trafficking unless we have a conversation here about prostitution, because it is all intertwined. And somebody has their hand up, but we will...
Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay.
Others are going to join in the conversation, but
does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, at some point the doorbell will ring, and some other people are going to join us, for the Thanksgiving table. But so, are you related to him? I'm sorry. Did you bring him in?
We have certain characteristics in common, but but no, actually, we're both Indians. He's a South Asian Indian, I'm a West Indian. Columbus sort of got it wrong, right?
Oh, are you the one who studied at that school in London? Or you taught at the London School of...
That Communist Haven, London School of Economics.
Oh,
yes.
that one, yeah.
So,
okay.
Right, and I've always been interested in the problem of slavery and ancient slavery, medieval slavery, modern slavery. And that interest, someone asked me, how did you get into that? If you grew up in Jamaica, where I grew up, you have to be interested in slavery, because we had the most brutal form of slavery in the world. And it's in an attempt to understand my own society, going into its past, that I got into the subject of slavery. Now, to get to the specific issues we're concerned with, when I started looking at slavery, after studying Jamaican slavery comparatively, figuring out what's going on elsewhere, one of the first things you learn is something which a French historian, Tourmaine, said as early as 1850. He said women were the first slaves.
Huh.
Women were the first slaves historically. And the great majority of persons who have been slaves were women. And that includes the modern world. And being a slave for a woman is a double burden at the very least, because it involves working in the fields with the men. In fact, quite often in the Caribbean, and to some extent the U.S. South, more women worked in the fields than men. But it also meant sexual exploitation. And so sex slavery was always an inherent part of slavery, even the commercial slavery of the U.S. So that's how my research for many, many years focused on what essentially constitutes this horrible experience of slavery and what has it meant. What has it meant that the West, our civilization, is distinctive in many ways, but in one particular way, it differs from almost all others in that at all the high points of Western civilization, slavery was foundational. Beginning, of course, with the civilization we see as our source, ancient Greece and Rome. They were slave societies, and women were the majority of slaves in those societies. And if you read the sort of, classic drama, one of the things, if you look underneath, you'll notice is almost all the women in classic drama were either slaves or terrified of being enslaved.
Huh.
And the same goes to the Middle Ages. People don't realize that there's a huge slave trade in the Middle Ages. And the reason why all the European languages have as the common root for the word slave, Slav, is that the typical slave, and Africans were not the first people identified as slaves. The typical slave was a Slav who were brought over from Eastern Europe primarily as sex slaves or as domestics. And both, again, it's complicated. If you're brought over as domestic, you ended up as a sex slave, and because you became the adolescent sort of sowed his seeds with you. So that was my work, trying to understand what did it do to Western civilization that at all its high point, either from the beginning but also in the modern world, slavery was so critical. A few years ago, some students came to me and said, Professor Patterson, we know you've been working on slavery through history and so on, but we're interested in slavery today, and we want you to give a course on the subject. As it turned out, I was working on the subject, and so that's how I became involved. And then something hit me. Tourmaine's statement that women were the first slaves came back to me because as I got more and more involved with modern slavery, I realized that women are the last slaves, in the sense that the way things are right now, the group of people who come closest to the traditional experience of enslavement, whether it's in the mines of Laurium in ancient Athens, or the latifundia of Rome, or the medieval slave fields, or modern slavery, are sex slaves in the purest sense. Because today what we have is an interesting situation where the notion of slavery has been used to define and reframe exploitative conditions around the world. And we've had arguments about that and so on, but I'm increasingly in agreement with that, because one of the interesting ways in which slavery is important is that not only is it a sort of major means of exploitation, but slavery as metaphor and slavery as negative force is very important. And the power, the horror we experience when we just confront the concept of being a slave, a nobody, total sort of socially dead person, is one which still resonates powerfully among modern people. And that served a very interesting function. It's meant that by reframing the exploited, especially exploited women around the world, as slaves, we have been able to redefine their condition as one we certainly see as a condition of social death, a horrible condition. And in fact, we suddenly become engaged with them. So to give you one example, more than half the world, women are forced into marriage, from the age of 10, 12, 13. Mm. And that's been seen as normal. I mean, the country spend billions of dollars on Afghanistan is common. So increasingly, people began to say, what is that condition to be a girl of 12 and married off to a man of 70 It is slavery. Before we did that, well, it's just their culture. We don't touch that, We're just interested in sending the military down there to fight the Taliban and so on. But suddenly realized almost more than a third of the people we're defending are in a condition of enslavement, because really, for such a girl, it's a life of slavery. And the work that CITAR is doing is also similar. Children, the carpets, the beautiful carpets we walk on in our homes, which again we simply take for granted. Oh, well, it's a traditional system they have there. Children do this. It's the way they make their living. We don't. You sort of rethink. What is it to be a child, to be placed like a cog in a machine, sitting down sort of 16, 17 hours a day, knitting, eating, sleeping there? That's slavery. And so we've used the negative power of slavery to redefine conditions around the world, which makes us now alert in a way in which we wouldn't have been if we just describe it as exploited labor. So that's what intrigues me about our modern situation. But to conclude, no other group is more, enslaved than, in fact, a woman who is trafficked, sold, and repeatedly sold in another country. That's the ultimate definition of the social death that is slavery.
Right. I'm thinking, is that Loretta Lynch there? The Attorney General,
It is.
right? So, Diane, you were in the kitchen while I was basting the turkey, and you were grading papers, right?
No.
So you're in that whole law school world, right?
I'm in
And
that
the
whole law
Loretta
school
Lynch
world.
world,
And she's
that-
our Attorney General, and Professor Phil Hyman was the Deputy Attorney General in the first Clinton administration. So yeah, I'm in that world. I'm in all these worlds, but and I came as Sherry's lawyer.
I need a lawyer, thank you.
And what I do in my work, and I'm extremely grateful that I have this opportunity to do it, is I work on women's civil rights and on translating experiences like Sherry's and like so many girls and women around the world into cognizable legal rights. And what I work on in particular is women's civil rights to challenge male sexual violence. So what Orlando was saying about we can analyze the systems of slavery and sex slavery and then patriarchy. And women were the original form of currency. I can just stop there, like discuss. Women were the original form of currency. And the idea that a male can buy or own or trade a woman to pay off debts or to, give to a friend or to prostitute in any myriad way is anathema to being a human. And what I really try to do with kind of what I've been given in this life is to listen to these stories and like I said, translate them. So I see gender-based violence as a big ball of multicolored yarn. And I tried to take apart the pieces of this. So I started working in this area of law because of working on an everyday basic domestic violence case where this woman was so scared and the courtroom was packed with women in the same situation, and it was just an everyday case where she's trying to get an order of protection and running for her life. And it just struck me like, what is the law doing about this? How is this such a norm that we just expect that women will run into court and get an order of protection,
Right.
So I worked on changing the institutional structure of the criminal justice system to actually build something like a better detention facility, but something to start changing the accountability structure. And instead of accepting battered women's situation, I call it endangered women's situation, as just life, changing that and changing the institutional structures around it, and then we'll stop asking questions like, well, why didn't she just leave? Why doesn't he leave? So I've also, another big piece of yarn that I work on is campus sexual assault and listening to survivors. And I've been teaching at the law school a course on Title IX since 2007, so way before it was so popularly in the news. And this is a time of real opportunity for a great discourse about how to move forward on a problem that I think everyone really is not denying anymore. I think that the recent study at Harvard really solidified the numbers. We know it's 1 in 5 of our college females will be sexually assaulted. So it's really a question of how do we have fair processes and how do we really change the community. Then on prostitution and sex trafficking, one of the links there is pimp and hoe parties on college campuses. So I wrote an article a couple years ago called Who Are You Calling a Hoe? Challenging the porn culture on college campuses. And that's the thing in the room, that's the big elephant in the room about which we don't speak, about which my students for years have wanted to speak but didn't have the space or the available discourse. But I think that media literacy on porn and really on changing the culture of porn that supports commercial sexual exploitation of women and girls is really key to just denormalizing all of this and to moving forward.
It's so interesting when you talk about that, because in the early 80s in Colorado, I was working on shelters for battered women. And so we got one shelter linked up with another and another all across the state so that we could all go together to a funder, and we'd be stronger, and we would, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, someone much smarter than I am said, why? What is wrong? Why are these women having to leave their homes if the guys are the ones who are beating them up? And then we had to change a very simple law that she didn't have to sign a complaint against him. The police could just walk in and say, look, he is standing there red with sweat pouring down him, and she has a busted lip. This is pretty obvious what happened. Come on, guy, you're coming with me. And that transformed the system because we focused on in that case, you would call him the violent, the perpetrator, et cetera. But in other words, we changed the focus. We had to have the shelters. We had to have the job programs. We had to have the support for the children. Absolutely necessary, but we didn't stop there. We said, no, wait a minute, let's look at this holistically. We have to hold him accountable. And it isn't a matter of demonizing him. We just have to hold him accountable. I mean, there were, like nowadays, that, quote, high frequency buyers of women and girls who are buying like 40 to 70 times a year. Their average income is $120,000. They're white, married with children, and they live in the suburbs. So it's not at all this idea that a lot of people have of, guys who are eking out, a $12,000 a year life, who are, spending $20 here or $50 there. I mean, that's not the high frequency. High frequency is quite different, and the numbers are astounding. I mean, if 15% of men in the U.S. they self-report having bought a woman or a girl, 15% is 15 million guys. I mean, once you start putting it into real numbers, 15 million guys, which means if we fill out this Thanksgiving table and go all the way around, we're going to have a guy around the table. And if I go to church, on the Sunday after Thanksgiving, there are going to be several guys sitting, near me, et cetera. And in fact, there are guys in my class. I've taught at the Kennedy School. I just don't know who, right? Because guys don't come in and say, hey, I'm a buyer. But we know that there are a lot because it's been normalized, like you said. I wonder if there are any questions or, yeah, okay, right over here, right over there. Yeah. Great. Do we have a microphone? Thanks. Welcome to our Thanksgiving table.
Thank you. Is this working?
Yes.
Rachel Martin, Human Rights for Women Dealing with Violence.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi. A couple of questions. I have a background in philosophy and theology, as do you.
Yes.
And language is really critical. It's really important. Language is how we frame everything. It's how everything moves forward and how we take action. There's a couple of questions on language I'd like to bring up right now.
Sure.
One is for yourself and one is for Diane, and also to include Sherry's ideas. In my research throughout history of philosophy, I have not found it to be the case that women are the original currency. If we look at the Torah and we look at the rape of Dinah, an entire village was wiped out to rectify the situation. She was not currency. That was a political issue, and it was recognized as such. If we go back to the Greek tradition, Odysseus found his way home by going to the queen and not to any of the warriors. So women as currency, to me, is not historically there in history. The prostitutes that helped the Jews win a major campaign, she was honored. Her life was saved. Her family was saved. She was not currency. She was a prostitute, but she was not currency.
She was, oh, yeah.
Now, I'd like to bring it over here to the next set of ideas.
Right.
In your writing, I see the word sex purchasers or high-frequency buyers.
Right.
What I haven't seen and I haven't heard tonight in any of the work yet is the word rape, serial rape, abduction, and torture, all of which all trafficking qualifies for under UN Convention. It qualifies. All trafficking, all the issues that we call sex trafficking
Right.
under UN definition qualify as torture, rape, and all those other things. So it depends on who's making the qualification. When the FBI looks at a woman,
Right.
is she being trafficked, and is that sexual exploitation for a financial value,
Right.
or is it rape because she's a private citizen? That's it. It's who's making the definition. The FBI's definition of rape was based on a 1929 definition until the year 2013. They only brought it forward. It is not very conclusive. You should take a look at their definition. It is really insufficient yet. That's what we're working with. This is the language. There was an article recently, a young woman said she had been trafficked.
Right.
She said she had been trafficked to, she calculated so many times a day, so many days, so many years. She came up with 43,000 incidents. That would be 43,000 incidents of decades of incarceration if all of those people were caught, because that is rape.
Right. It's
We need to
statutory
define
rape.
it correctly.
Right.
When we look at the demand side,
We have to.
okay, so I just want to
The turkey
put
is
those out there.
getting very
Thank
dry.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's fascinating to me, and I appreciate very much. And you know, this is
I have two
yeah,
quick things
yeah,
to say about
sure.
that. In the Bible, it also says that if you rape a woman, you can pay her. You can pay the man who owns her at the time, either her father or her husband, a fine for that rape. Okay, I mean, we're not going to debate theology here right now, but Gail Rubin is the source of the history for women being the original currency.
You know what's so interesting to me is when you start looking at the individual girl or woman, then you start very, very much getting into questions of, was she raped, was she not, was she consenting, was she not, was she selling herself, not being sold, was she selling herself in order to put herself through law school, was she, etc. And doesn't she have the right, as a consenting adult with a consenting man, to have a business transaction? And in fact, if someone objects to what she's doing, let's put her on the stand. Let's put her on the stand, and let's then put her in court so that she can testify that she was doing such and such free will, And all of a sudden, the picture starts changing, and maybe that's not where we should focus. Maybe we should focus on the fact that actually every one of the 10 men who bought her that night was breaking a law. Orlando?
We don't need to get too much into historical detail, but I have to set the record clear. The great majority of slaves in ancient, certainly in the world of Odysseus, were women. One of the greatest classical historians, Moses Finley, in his World of Odysseus, makes it absolutely clear. And if you read the epics clearly, you'll see that. As for women as currency, look, one of the most, this goes back to a point I made earlier of what is normal, seen as normal when reinterpreted, is seen as slavery. So, almost all anthropological texts you read will refer to something called bride price or bride wealth in a large number of traditional societies. Women were bride price, a bride price rather was paid for women when they're married, and they were transferred from one kinship group to another. Now, the traditional normalized anthropological way of seeing this is that, no, this has nothing to do with a sale. This has nothing to do with sale. And these women were honorable. This was simply a ritual transfer of goods in which the woman moved from one kinship group to another. And that is a good example of what I'm saying. Today, we think of that. It still happens. Now, yeah, it is a kind of sale. She was being sailed, and now do we take the view, and this is going to come up over and over, we had this whole thing with sort of clitoral cutting and so on. Are we to say, this is their tradition, it is a bride price, and we won't even call it a price, and anthropologists, in order to be discreet, refer to it as bride wealth. Or is this a sale? I mean, so there's a woman being sold from one group to, and what I'm saying is that concepts change and our view of things change, and it seems to me that I'm prepared to say now, I'm no longer going to normalize it by saying this is a tradition, because it does go along with a certain view of women, and it does indicate a certain status and a certain relationship to men, which if in this era of human rights, we feel, well, no, we're no longer going to normalize that anymore. This is a kind of slavery. Anyway.
I want to make a point, too, about these, people get caught up in these distinctions also, right? What's trafficking, what's prostitution, what's forced, what's, all these different things. And we rarely have that, we rarely talk about what it is to be prostituted here, what it is to be a commodity, and the harm of what that does, just that alone, right? And the fact that when you're talking about being prostituted and using your body, okay, as a commodity, and thinking that we can do that and we can separate ourselves from it, it's like when you get into that discussion, then people sometimes look at this like, okay, just not getting into the who was forced or who was, but just the fact of the harm of using your body, and trying to kind of keep yourself intact here. Because let me tell you, and I'll say this, after so many years, and if you've been in this over 4, 5, 6 years, you can't keep yourself intact in that way. You become split. You dissociate, you start, it's a really complicated thing. And sometimes I like people to understand that, just that act of what it is to be used for, because not very many things and not many jobs do we use our body as to sell it, and then trying to keep ourselves. We use different names. We separate ourselves from that act, and that alone is that is dehumanizing and degrading. So let's get away from the distinctions. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. It does to me.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Sherry, you've sort of touched on one of the most sensitive areas in this, because as you know, there's a significant number of feminists who have argued, taken a different position.
Yes.
That, in fact, there is such a thing as sex work, voluntary sex work, and that this relates to the whole issue of agency, that women have a right to do with their bodies as they please. And by the way, I share your position. I'm playing devil's advocate here. And several sociological studies, one, of course, by Venkatesh, indicates that in Chicago and in the studies in New York that well over 50% of older women, that is to say not teenagers, are in it voluntarily, that in fact they go in and out of it depending on their economic circumstances, and that they don't feel that they're being abused, that this is their choice and they can do with their bodies as they please. Very smart young sociologist who was at Boston College, Kimberly Huang, was written on prostitution in Vietnam, feels very strongly about this. In fact, her analysis, which won a lot of prizes, indicates how women in Vietnam who voluntarily enter the sex industry do better economically than women working in sweatshops. So there is this debate, and of course, among my students, and every time I speak, I always get someone, I don't know, we may well have someone in the audience here who may take the position that there is such a thing, and one has to make a distinction between real slaves, trafficked women who have been tricked through fraud or what have you, or forced because of circumstances to enter the commercial sex trade, either at home or abroad. They're the real slaves, but we should distinguish them from women who are voluntarily doing this. And I think you're best qualified to sort of respond to that.
When you said, there was a time in my life that I could probably say, considering I had little options, that's how women get into this, that I made more money, even though I didn't keep it, than what would have been my other option, right? Minimum wage, couldn't support my family, couldn't have a decent place to live, right? So sure, we could make that argument, but what happens though? Is that the answer to when you have no options? Because this is the part that there are times in all of us that have done this probably who said, oh, I can do this, this is okay. But really, and I've talked to hundreds of women about this, because usually when I meet women, that's the one thing they always want to talk about, is their difficulty now with that, because they've used their body, what it is to be in a healthy relationship, to be intimate with somebody. You lose yourself in that. So I'm sorry, I'm sure you could find maybe 2% of women that have come out of that and said, oh, this is okay, I wasn't harmed in this. At the end of what I was doing, I was using heroin on a daily basis because I couldn't turn a date without using heroin. It's sort of what happens. So when you ask somebody, one might say, oh, but that woman has better options doing that. It's much more complicated than that. And also, how long can you do this without really, it destroys you at the end. I can't emphasize that enough. And that's where I want to, when talking about what it is to be prostituted. And this is the only job where we use our bodies. At the end, it's just harmful. You come out of that not really whole here. And most of the women I meet want to talk about that. They're not a whole person anymore. They don't know they don't even know how to talk about it. They don't know how to have relationships. You become so disconnected is the word. So I don't know if that's the way I could describe it.
I have a question for the whole family here. I don't know how the heck you are all related to me. I know how many of you are related to me, but, and I know that actually at my family things I never get to talk, so this is really unusual. And there's like so much, oh my God. Anyway, how many of you have ever done yoga? Great, almost everyone in the room. So the principle of yoga is uniting movement and breath. And we know from years of study that, I've done yoga with Swani.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
That breathing is so important to connect your mind and your body and your spirit. And in 2003, I was involved in a documentary called Rape Is, and by Cambridge Documentary Films. And as part of the documentary, we included a section on prostitution. And it was the first film on rape to include specifically a section on prostitution. And the stories from the 5 rape survivors featured in the film, and the story from Vandita Carter, who talked about her work in saving women and girls and her wonderful project called Breaking Free in Minneapolis, was just the same. That the rape victims all said the same things as the prostituted women, that I had to dissociate myself in order to complete the act. And that is by definition an inhuman thing to do. It's unhealthy. And you have to look at and consider the texture of a person's life in this and say, what kind of rights does that person have? And you know, as a lawyer, is there something that we can do to promote social justice and gender equality? And then what systems do we have to tackle or challenge or really call into question, like patriarchy, to produce different results?
But guys can't, I mean, but guys are born, look, I used to in the late 60s, early 70s, it was really important to me that there weren't any differences between men and women.
There are.
There
But go
actually,
ahead.
well, the brain science is showing more and more, right? And so one of the things that it shows is that guys can't control themselves. Like,
You are my cousin. Oy, here we go. Have some more wine. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I mean, I don't mean to be insulting, said Harth in Orlando. I don't mean to insult you, but guys can't control themselves. And, you know,
There's
it's like we
always one in
might
the
as
group.
well adjust to your failures. And
Since you rule the world, you just.
yeah, it's unfortunate that you rule the world, right? I mean, no offense, but
You don't look amused.
So we need laws.
you need laws?
Yeah. That's one way to get them to control. But, you know, I really want to get back to this question because it intrigues me of what it is that constitutes what is fundamental about the dehumanization of prostitution. And you know, it's part of our liberal tradition that the one thing you're not permitted to do is to sell your body. You own your body, but you're not permitted to sell it. There is this sort of it's foundational. It's primal, that idea. And it seems to me that every act then of prostitution involves such a dehumanizing, ultimately dehumanizing act, which gets to the heart of what we consider most sacred, which is that we own and possess ourselves. But we do not have, the one right we do not have is to sell our bodies. And, you know, now, that of course, raises another question, which is if a person does such a thing, is she guilty of an offense? And in a way, for a long time, the law, it seems to me, in making prostitution a crime, was in a sense taking that easy, if you like, drawing that conclusion. But what's new about the abolition movement and so on is to say, wait a minute. If someone is so desperate as to do such a thing, then we've got to realize that there's something wrong, that they have to have been a victim, because, you know, it is sort of violating the most fundamental element of being human, to sell one's body. And you view them not then as someone who has offended or committed a crime, but as someone who is the ultimate victim to have been in a situation to do that.
Right.
I mean, that's what's new, and that, in fact, what informs the recent changes in the laws, at least in America. But we hope, and the work which Demand Abolition has to do, is to persuade other societies that to view it this way, that someone who's is led to violate this fundamental principle that you do not sell your body has to be a victim.
And men, I think, given the fact that you can't control yourselves, then you have a right to be the buyer of, and that's not a violation, right? Poor guy.
Poor guy. I've been very quiet since I struggle to control myself. But I've done a good job. I've been listening with interest to what the fellow attendees of our Thanksgiving meal have been saying, and I think a few things have kind of struck me or resonated with me, I would say. And one is the very, I think, crucial point that Sherry makes around the fact that there aren't very clear lines in many cases, in most cases, that you can say this is category A and this is category B. And that fuzziness crucially centers around this concept of consent or free will. And the myriad forces in society that vitiate consent or free will, all the forces of duress or disenfranchisement or subjugation or otherness. And I think it was puzzling to me that there's even this question that's been raised that women, female gender has not historically and for all time been disproportionately subjugated and exploited. I thought that was we had come to terms and agreed with that. That across culture, across history, whether it's looking at them as currency or slaves or property, we kind of had, in the 21st century, at least come to some agreement that, yeah, that's by and large how female gender has been treated by male gender across time, space, up to and including right here today. And we can always find an example that counters that prevailing truth, but the broad reality is that's the experience of most women throughout history, most girls throughout history, up to and including today. One of the things that has always stuck with me, I hear many extraordinary things that from the slaves that I've documented. And this one woman in Moldova, we were talking about gender violence and sexual violence. And she said to me something, and it's in my book, I remember it to this day. She said, in your country, she was telling me, in your country, when a man beats a woman, you call the police. In my country, we call it tradition. And the depth of that statement hit me in a way that I still haven't quite recovered from, that this was her cultural experience. And then I heard sentences like that in rural Nepal and outside of San Diego and in Nigeria. I mean, this pan-cultural experience of women being treated as property or as punching bags of society, of men. Now, is it a function of not being able to control ourselves? Is it hormonal? Is it, I mean, I have no idea. I'm not an expert in all of that, but we can look at the truth of what most women's experiences are, particularly the further afield you go from sort of our Western system of culture and law. Now, within that context, you have to then think about sexual violence and how problematic it is to try to draw these lines between free will and consent and exploitation and force and fraud and coercion, because if the history and experience of female gender is so infected with this violence and so problematized by being subordinated and being property, then sure, theoretically, there can be cases of true free will, but when you start to peel it back and look at all the forces of duress that attend these decisions, you can make an argument in 99, well, in my experience, at least 90 cases out of 100, that there are many forces that negate any concept of free will. One of the big debates we have in my class when I teach it is we have a class on sex trafficking and then I have a class on organ trafficking. And this same question kind of comes up both times. Well, doesn't that really impoverished, poor father in rural Bangladesh have a right to sell his kidney if it means his children will go to school and be uplifted out of poverty? And who are we as imperialist Westerners to tell him what he can and can't do with his body? And it's kind of the same argument that's sometimes made of who are we to tell a young woman what she can and can't do with her body. But when you start to peel it back and you look at all the negative outcomes of that transaction for him, well, he's not going to get the aftercare. He's going to get an infection. He's going to face stigma. He probably can't work ever again. He's going to die 3 years later. And that money is never actually going to get to him and his family. It's going to go to the broker and this guy and the doctor in the clinic. So his outcome is actually immeasurably worse when you layer on reality to the theory. And in most cases that I've documented of sex trafficking, it goes something like that. Actually, her outcomes are going to be much worse in that she's going to face stigma. Most of the financial benefit does not come to her. And that cycle continues down generations. So I don't know if I'm trying to sort of synthesize a lot of what the wonderful comments that I've been hearing, and just want to leave that point of you have to look at the real cases when you try to theorize about what is in the best interests of people.
I'm glad you're in my family. Can we hang out sometime? So a couple quick things about the evolution of law. But there's this one case that I think about. It was a dwarf tossing case in France. And a dwarf petitioned a UN court in France to say, I need to participate in dwarf tossing. It was illegal. I need to participate in dwarf tossing because I'm a dwarf, and I can make the most money.
I don't know what that means.
Dwarf tossing, it's like at circuses where a big male will throw a dwarf, like as a joke, and see how far he can throw it. They have contests on dwarf tossing. So it's been outlawed mostly, but this was in the 90s. So he petitions the court to say, I can make the most money doing this. I'm a dwarf, and I want to participate in this. And the UN court said, there are some forms of labor that are so inherently dehumanizing that we can't recognize this as a legitimate force of labor. So I want to say that. And I also wanted to pick up on what Cousin Orlando said about the evolution of law, which is really coming around to recognizing the texture of someone's life, like Sherry, and saying, you're not a criminal, you are victimized and in need of help. So we're not criminalizing you, but actually buying sexual access to another human being is a crime. And it's been a crime in the United States for years and years and years, but it's just not enforced. So, the Johns could get off with paying a $100 fine, which they were able to afford, and the women were, back out in the streets. But it's changing. So the Swedish model and the Nordic model, and what's been adopted in many countries, is actually helping women get out, and punishing, and making it abnormal, to think that it's okay to buy women for sex and children for sex.
Yeah, and one of the people whom I didn't invite today is he's a vice squad, and he told me that they were picking up, on average in the U.S., about 9 women and girls and charging them for every 1 man. Now, if you do the math, those 9 were with 10 or 11 men in a night. So let's call that 100 men. They were picking up 1 man and 10 of the sellers, if you will, okay? The buyers and the sellers, if you think of the economic theory, with the pimps as the distributors, right? So that creates a huge problem, right? Because everything is tilted toward penalizing her, and the guys, it's not just that they're paying $100, they aren't even being picked up, and one of the cops told me, here's how we do it, we stake out, and we see these guys coming in and out of an apartment, and we watch and watch throughout the night, all these guys coming in and out of the apartment, then we go in and we pick her up. And I'm thinking, excuse me? Every one of those guys was breaking a law, and you went in and picked her up, at which point she gets beat up by her pimp for having, cost some money.
Sure.
By being charged. I mean, and I heard that story over and over and over. We also, before I see somebody rang the doorbell, but I'll see who it is. But before I do, here's some good news. It goes with the pumpkin pie, okay? And that is that we did interviews with 100 men who were buying here in Boston. First an hour on the phone and then 3 hours sitting with them individually at South Station. And 88% said that if a family member was going to find out, they would stop. 88% said they would stop if a family member was going to find out. Is there a microphone over here? Yes. And who are you, please? You must be related to Orlando. I can tell.
Undoubtedly. Different islands, but is this on? Taina Bien-Aimé from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, and thank you all. This is food for my soul, so thank you. Professor Patterson, I hope that your words of wisdom reach Amnesty International, which is about to issue a decision calling on governments to decriminalize pimps, brothel owners, and buyers. Not a human rights framework whatsoever. But my question is again about language, and specifically about the term sex work, which we know is a term that was invented by the sex industry and its supporters to sanitize, normalize mainstream prostitution and violence in the sex trade. And unfortunately, in the last 5 years or so, the train has left the station, and just about every media, from print to television, uses the term indiscriminately. And I just have a small story before I ask you about the term sex work. We work with the medical community, of which a young doctor, Anita Ravi, went to Rikers Island and interviewed 25 women about their access to health care. This was over the summer, and it was a third African American, a third Latina, and a third white. And they were in prison. They had all been prostituted at one point in their lives, but were not in jail because of prostitution for other offenses. And so she asked them about the term sex work. Not one knew what it was. One woman said, "Are you talking about a psychologist who massages people for sexual pleasure?" And so with that, I just want, especially to you, Terry, I wanted to find out more about that terminology and the harm that it's causing.
Oh, I remember that term when it was coined back in the 70s. And then I wonder how after, all these years it's become such a term now and used so frequently, and there's such a split between, those that coin this as a job and sex work. And I don't know if I have an answer to that, but all I know is I feel like it goes along with sort of our market culture here, where everything is like, buying and selling, and everything is termed into, and it's sort of been co-opted and used, and people don't even realize that, even the people that use that term, right? Like sex workers, it's like they don't even know what they're talking about. And again, yes, we don't use that language, and there's no one that I've met in these 10 years that they call this this is their work, that you define it as their job, but I think we've been so disillusioned or kind of tricked into kind of coming to, and understand it that way. I mean, I don't know if I have the right answer, but I just know that we need a lot of education here with all our colleagues here to kind of get people to really, what are we doing here? In so many levels, not just the term sex work, but so many other on other things that are going on.
Yeah, please. You, yes. Oh, you're looking for a microphone. No, Will. Equal rights.
No, talking about education. While you were talking,
stand up.
Okay.
And who are you?
I'm Ignacio from Argentina. Yeah, I'm at the school. Yeah.
Did we have an Argentine now? Is that one of your cousins?
Don't cry for him.
Okay. So you talked about the problems with consumers, about pornography, about the problem that sometimes we as men have to control ourselves. And you are talking right now about education. Which role do you think that sexual ethics play in this scenario, and what could be done from that perspective to improve the situation? That would be my question.
That's a great question.
That's a great
Thank
question.
you.
And thanks for bringing the wine. Do you have an answer to that? I bet, because I bet that you have some thoughts on that, being at the ed school.
I feel we are omitting to work on this issue, and it could have a huge impact from the preventive side.
Right. I think that's a great point. Thanks. That there's an ethic involved in treating other people as human beings. And I think that absolutely should be part of any kind of culture change program, especially like looking at pornography as a particular form of propaganda that reinforces that it's okay for men to treat women as much, much, much less than human beings or even animals.
Could I link it up with the earlier question which was asked, especially in light of the UN's, rather, of the Amnesty International terrible decision? They just sent me their annual letter for support, which I'm not going to for the first time in many years. But, it's interesting. We've been defining the issue in terms of the rights of women, but there's another way to approach it, and it's not in opposition, it's maybe complementary, and that is the rights of work, and to come to some understanding of what constitutes legitimate, dignified, acceptable work, and that there are certain kinds of activities which are simply verboten. We can think of many forms of demeaning work, such as, what was exposed in Brazil, the sort of charcoal workers who spend 16, 17 hours a day in what is the most hellish possible condition, fumes around them, sort of inhaling sort of gases which is going to kill them. We define that as unacceptable in human work. I mean, one could say that there is a kind of work, such as selling your body, which we define not so much in terms of sex work and so on, but it's just not acceptable in a civilized community or within law or as work. So, but what has happened is that it's just slipped into the language because, in a sense, we have no clear notion of what constitutes dignified, acceptable, humane work. And I don't know if that's even entered the law, in terms of a definition of where you draw the line. I said, this is work you cannot do. And I guess given our political climate, it may be hard to do that. I hope that's not the case. But one group of thinkers, in fact, have increasingly argued for redefining the entire issue in terms of the rights of labor, of what constitutes acceptable forms of work. And if you do it that way, then you may simply say, well, this is outside the framework. And a group such as Amnesty International, which is centrally preoccupied with human rights, could just be told, this is a violation of people's, the rights of labor, if you like, or the right of work, and a violation of our fundamental human right. That I'm still appalled that they made that decision, given their preoccupation with human rights.
Yeah, but the decision was based on what they called harm reduction, saying that since you can't control yourselves, we're going to try to have as little harm done by you by making sure that women who are being bought have panic buttons next to them, because they'll be in a room with some, in a brothel that has a camera, and they can push a panic button. I mean, so here we are. Over here, over there, and then that's it. Because we have added leaves to the table, and we need microphone.
Hi.
Oh.
Hi.
And there.
My name is Antoine, and I'm a third-year law student here. I guess what did I want to talk about? Geez, I'm blinking. Sorry, I look at my notes for a second. The men. We need to talk about the men, because I feel like we've put so much emphasis on what she's doing and if is she breaking the law. But actually, and I want to take seriously this notion that men have a control problem. They do. We do. Historically, in the present moment, we are dominating all economic and political systems. There is no dispute about that. Men have a control problem, and I think we need to look at who are these Johns buying women and their pimps, exploiting them. Like, what is it about masculinity? And for this, you should take a look at the Tough Guys documentary. I forget who's it by. Professor Rosenfeld could tell you that. But yeah, I think we need to really take seriously masculinity and what it is about. What is it about psychology that makes it okay to use someone? And that's just my next point about feminism. And you brought up earlier that some feminists think prostituted women are engaging in sex work. And I don't think we should give that definition to them. I think you can call yourself whatever you want. People call themselves a lot of things. It doesn't mean that you're a feminist. What we should be asking, the litmus test, is if you are, whether or not you're talking about sex equality.
Right, okay, thanks.
And third point, Professor Patterson, I don't think your analogy to selling a kidney is a good or useful one here, and I think it goes back to the fact that why we need to look at men and what they deem as intelligible here, because selling a kidney is not the same as being fucked, going through fuck after fuck after fuck just to survive, to feed your children. It's not an apt comparison. And we need to be looking at it from the perspective of women who, are just trying to survive. It's not the same thing as choosing to sell your kidney.
Okay, let's
I know
move
we're
it.
both called Indians, but that was Siddhar's point.
Okay, and what we're going
Oh
to
my
do
God.
is move the microphone. There's so much interest here. We're going to move the microphone around, and then I'm going to ask you all. We never had a blessing before this meal, so I'm going to ask you each to do a very quick blessing.
Yeah.
Do you know what a blessing is? Have I crossed cultures here? You're just going to say something to close this out. It's actually going to be a benediction. Okay, yes.
So let's believe
and who
I'm
you are.
the 10-watt light bulb among this family of 100 watts and also brilliance. I can neither discuss the philosophical or historical significance of women as currency, transcend the violations of civil women's rights, violations into law and processes that make them better, or study the supply chains and understand the economic impact of this problem or have personal experience. So for a normal person, average person like me, how would you guys boil down this issue so that I can understand it? And insofar you can make me passionate about it, what would be the recommendation that you would give me of something I could do to help stop this atrocity?
And who are you?
And it's Rose Gould.
Thanks, Rose. We're going to take it around, and then you all will. Yes. And who are you?
That's a good question. I'm Ananta Giri from the Madras Institute of Development Studies, India. I'm visiting scholar here. Thank you all. First of all, my query to you is this kind of statement that guys cannot control themselves.
Yes.
Let us reflect upon what kind of statement it is. And it might be deeply essentialistic and deeply humiliating. It really constructs a sense of gender essentialism, which is not necessarily supported by history, society, and science. And with that kind of gender essentialism, it is difficult to move towards the aspired for realm of sexual ethics. My quick query to Professor Patterson is that you yourself hinted at the limits of liberal assumptions. Therefore, if we follow that query seriously, then it has deep implication for concept of work and labor. And therefore, the language of sex work, as it might have been abused by some, but it also raises the question of emic and ethic. That if the people who are engaged in sex work feel comfortable in this use, and I must say that I have talked to some prostitutes and sex workers, there are many number of studies about prostitutions. So therefore, the whole idea of prostitution itself as an activity must be understood in its plural manifestations, in which women themselves are also involved in varieties of ways and not just as victims. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Michelle. I'm another third-year law student here. I wanted to thank you so much for such a rich and variegated discussion on the issue of trafficking. We touched on many different issues, including the issue of consent.
Could you keep your voice up? So
Yes, there are many issues that were discussed in relation to the topics, including the issue of consent. The fact that you have to really look at the cases themselves to really understand how complicated things are on the ground, even if we theorize at the general theoretical legal level on what trafficking is and what it's constituted of. And also this issue of language and how we talk about trafficking and prostitution and how that further creates problems. And I don't want to divert the discussion too much from this really interesting discussion that we've been having, but I couldn't help but think about, in light of the global attention on the migrant crisis, how migrant smuggling also seems to be another issue that's intimately intertwined with the issues that we're discussing, and also touches on the very same issues of consent, the complication when it comes to the actual cases of the individuals involved, and the language that we use to describe the plight of the people who are involved in the very same dynamics that we're discussing here. So I was just wondering if you had a chance, if you could speak as to your perspective on how the migrant smuggling crisis kind of relates to the discussion so far.
And I should warn you, they really won't have a chance because they're only going to get one sentence at the end, and probably they're going to want to inspire. Please.
Thank you. I'm Nate Zalanka. I'm a concerned husband and father. And what I wanted to say is that what we see here is one thing. I noticed that the booklet you've handed out about the new abolitionists is based in New York, and I was hoping that somebody in your team might begin a similar effort in Boston. We certainly have enough people here who share the idea. But looking globally, it seems with the massive influx of people from the third of the world who don't necessarily share our concepts of sexual equality, we have a massive increase, for example, in the number of rapes taking place in Sweden. Okay, that is the one issue that has really begun to disturb me. And I was wondering if there are any plans to extend our concerns in some sort of effective way on a global scale.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to do one more and tell you in terms of scale that in terms of, we've been putting fake ads up on Backpage. And there are, in the course of 1 month in Boston, in just Boston, in terms of number of times a man texts or calls a woman who is being, or a girl who is being advertised to be sold on Backpage, it's hundreds of thousands of times in 1 month that there's a text or a call. So just to make sure we understand the scale here, yes.
Thank you. My name is Janet. I'm with the New Jersey Red Umbrella Alliance. We are
The New Jersey
Red Umbrella Alliance. We are an alliance of sex workers dedicated to promoting the needs and rights of sex workers in New Jersey. And I feel that if this panel were to really be complete and a lot of these people's questions would be answered, we should have had a more diverse panel of some consensual adult sex workers, because there are a lot of issues that are not being addressed as to perhaps men in business with the rent boy bust that was done. Human trafficking was not an issue at all. Another thing that needs to be addressed is a lot of these situations that these women are trying to escape is due to the economic inequalities. So we're being forced into this, and then we're being, in turn, we're being victimized even further by the laws that criminalize us. We're further becoming victims at the hands of law enforcement, who further sit there and rape us. And then when we try to report these kind of assaults, nothing is done. We are further victimized with retaliation,
Right.
with arrests. So what are we doing to address the issues that there is consensual sex work? And a lot of these people writing these laws are the ones who are the purchasers of our services.
Right.
And
Right.
the language does need to be addressed because we're not selling our bodies. We are providing a service like anyone else. Like people who are in nursing homes are providing services. That is intimate body labor work, what those people do. The same as sex work. We are consensual sex workers. A lot of us are not being forced or coerced. A lot of us are escaping dangerous situations like domestic violence.
Right.
And the only way out is consensual sex work. And some of these people that we interact with are not just purchasing sex. They're purchasing companionship. They're helping to mentor us. They're supporting us. They're helping us to get out of these harmful situations that pushed us into sex work, because it's not always just sex work. It is true companionship.
I
It is
understand.
escorting. It's not just a narrow look at everyone's being forced into it and they're just being trafficked. There are children being trafficked, but I know a lot of Mexicans that are coming here in agriculture, they're being trafficked. They're not allowed to leave where they work. They're not allowed to speak out against the labor inequalities they're suffering, and they're getting paid less than minimum wage. No
You
one's
know,
addressing that in
I-
human trafficking.
I don't want to cut you off because I think it perpetuates the idea that you just said, like, why isn't your voice being heard here? But I want to tell you, that for me personally, you and I share like 90% of the same drive in terms of human dignity. And I am so opposed to criminalizing women and girls who are, or boys who are selling their body. Their bodies. I am adamantly opposed to that for many, many reasons, but including what you just said about the fact that you can't go to the police safely for help because of the way this screwed up system has been set up, right? And the very people who are writing laws are often the purchasers. I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree. Now, you and I differ on a piece of it, okay? I have to tell you, I completely believe what you said also about the companionship and about loneliness. I absolutely believe that there are guys who are purchasing for that reason. I think that the question comes, how do you create laws that balance that take all of that into account, and that also protect for the very reasons that you said about women who are doing this as a last resort? Like, how do you structure a legal system that takes that into account? I'm with you on that. Last words. You've heard an awful lot, but we're at the end of our Thanksgiving table, and I need you all to, there's not a particular order, just so each one of you speaks, and you have a total of 3 minutes.
A total? That's a lot.
A total.
I thought it was just one
Meaning
sentence.
collectively?
No,
or
a total,
Oh, total, oh.
T-O-T-A-L.
Oh, a total of.
Okay.
He can't talk for just a total of, for a quarter of a total of 3
Okay,
minutes.
so the issue is raised of consent and of what constitutes the right of people to do with their bodies and their feelings and their emotions as they wish by two persons in very vivid terms. There are profound philosophical issues raised here, and in fact, there have been several very, very good books written by philosophers on this issue, most of whom come down on the fact that, there is a contradiction in liberalism here, which sort of makes paternalism one of the great evils, that it's paternalistic to tell someone what they can do with their body. So there's a contradiction. But are there circumstances under which one, in fact, will have to accept this paternalism? And there are several arguments which may make it necessary to make this an exception. It has to do, one of them has to do with health. That in fact, prostitution raises issues that go beyond just the two people involved. As you know, prostitution has been a major vector of the AIDS epidemic. And so one can therefore argue that it does not involve just the two people, but the society at large, not only with respect to physical health, but also mental health.
So what's your blessing?
It may normalize it. And I do want to answer the person who asked about what can be done. There are many organizations now which are involved with this. I mean, they're all around. Polaris, there's Stop Demand, and so on. You can simply become involved with one or other of them. My blessing is that we will continue the struggle to expand our point of view to a broader to the other parts of the world. The State Department does this with their Trafficking in Persons annual report. But that, of course, works in two ways, because just the fact that the American State Department is involved may give certain negative signals. But I think we should attempt to broaden this work we're doing, this struggle, to make other people see that this constitutes a form of slavery, and that is something we should get rid of.
So I want to speak for all the women that I've met over these years. You know, we've all, and I would assume you are in the sex trade, I guess, right? So we've all had very different experiences. We really have, right? We've come out of this in different ways, but the women I have met, for the hundreds of women I have met, you know, their stories to me are like horrendous as far as, and I agree around the economic inequality and everything that renders women vulnerable to this. But none of them have said to me that they want out of this. You know, how do I get out of this? So they're the voices that you very rarely hear in all of this, really. And I've witnessed how this sex industry has changed also. And I listen to these women, and it's so much more brutal now. And I say that, and with all my heart, that this has become a much more harmful industry. And that's the voices that I hear every day. I have. And, you know, and I also see something going on here, too, is when I work with women and I see, you know, a lot of them come out of systems. Then as they become 19, 20 and have children, their children go back into the very systems here that they came out of. It's a cycle that we really need to address. To me, you know, and whatever our circumstances are, and I've had friends and I have women that told me that they weren't harmed in this either, and that's fine. I get that, okay. But for all the women I've met that have been harmed, and that are so marginalized and and not afforded opportunity here is what we need to address. And every place has a program that you can get involved in, you know, and in so many ways, whether it's education, giving voice to women. You know, there's just, I don't know. I think if you all walk away with something, you know, we really need change in this country in many ways, but this industry, we really need to address it. It cannot be the answer for women that have been marginalized now. And you know, undereducated, not being afforded opportunity.
Okay, my blessing starts with this mural in Harvard Square where the theater used to be that says, it has all these women, and it says, indication of harm, now proof of harm is our call to action. And thinking about and listening to and being responsive to the harm of people's lives who are prostituted or trafficked is really, really important, whatever we call it. And I agree language is really important. I also agree that we probably agree on 90% of, you know, you should be able to call the police without them, you know, threatening you or raping you. I had a student many years ago who said that when I was teaching about prostitution, she said that she was French, and she said that she hoped that in 50 years we would look back on prostitution and like we look back on slavery in the United States and say, wow, that was a really ugly period. How did we sustain such an industry? So that's my blessing, and that each of you can envision a world where it's not okay to buy sexual access to another human being?
Well, I don't feel qualified to dole out blessings, so I'm going to give a parting thought. And my parting thought is this, that having spent 15 years now traveling the world documenting cases of labor trafficking, sex trafficking, child labor, forced labor, debt bondage, most every face of contemporary human servitude, it is, I think, quite clear that these forms of servile exploitation disproportionately, overwhelmingly impact the marginalized, the impoverished, the disenfranchised, those who lack reasonable alternatives. And that phrase is so crucial to everything I've ever done and seen, the absence of a reasonable alternative. And if we start at that baseline and then think, how do we craft our policies and laws? Whose rights do we want to protect? Because you can't protect everyone's rights perfectly at all times. You kind of have to choose. And I would say, thinking about this issue, it's clear to me we need to be protecting the rights of that population of people who are disenfranchised, impoverished, marginalized, scarcely able to participate in the world and global economy that we participate in. And if you take that standpoint, I think it becomes very clear the kinds of policies and laws you enact vis-a-vis the issue of sex trafficking or prostitution. You can't protect everyone, but maybe the right approach is to protect the most vulnerable and the most weak in our global society. And as I listened to our friend from New Jersey, I almost thought, God, this is one of the most powerful arguments I've heard for the Nordic model.
What's the Nordic model?
The Nordic model of take away all of the penalty and crime on the seller of sex and put that penalty and crime on the purchaser, the consumer, the John, and the pimps and traffickers and whatnot. Because you want to eliminate further harm and victimization of that quote-unquote seller in order to protect society at large from the large proportion of people who are going to be in that condition out of duress and poverty and lack of reasonable alternative. So that's my parting thought, is to just think about whose rights we really are trying to protect here. And if we're talking about human rights, Amnesty International, or any human rights paradigm, I think you always have to think about protecting the rights of the people who are the most vulnerable or the most weak within our societies.
And I will add as my parting thought, it's so easy to divide up and say the women and girls who are selling, being sold, are the weak ones, and the men are the powerful ones. But when I have talked with men who are, in fact, buying, and I have many times talked to them, what I hear goes along with that 88% who say if a family member was going to find out, they would stop because they feel very, very ashamed. One of them said, it's a darkness in my life. Another one said, I've got a monkey on my back. I can't get out of this. Another one said, well, it's okay because, she's making a living and, and that's what, and I said, give her $100. Just give her $100. You don't have to fuck her, as you said. Just give her $100 if that's your concern. Spend an evening with her, whatever, go to dinner. So when I think about these guys and how messed up they are in those moments as they say these illogical things, really smart guys, and they're so scared that their wife, their other partner is going to find out. Because you know what'll happen? There's a really good chance she's going to leave with the kids, and the kids then are going to be going back and forth and back and forth, mom's house, dad's house, and there's this coarsening of conscience in his life as well as in the society, it's really a no-brainer for me that it's not like this is somehow good for him and bad for her. It's bad for everybody. It's bad for us all. It's like slavery was bad for the owners, not as bad as it was for the, for the slaves back in our history, just in American history, but it was bad for the owners too in terms, and there were slaves in, back when Lincoln was deciding about what the stand would be on slavery, and they were saying, you know what, in our home, in our family, we have been treated well, we have been educated by our family that we work for, and my parents and their parents, and this is working for us. Don't mess with it, leave it alone. And there were people who were abolitionists, who said, you know what, it may be working for you, it's not working for us as a society, it's not working for us as humanity, this is not the country we want to have. And just on the basis of that, we have to end it. And we're going to end this, Rose, we're going to end this situation. I don't mean that tonight, I do mean that we are going to end the buying and selling of people's bodies, and we're going to do it by focusing on the men. It's in what's called the Nordic model. There are about 14 or 15 different tactics you can use, and they're really, really interesting. And Rose, if you want to go, and Sir, if you want to go on the site of Demand Abolition, you can read about 11 cities that we're using for pilots, and the people there are coming up with their own strategies, using different tactics, combinations of tactics, to see how, in fact, you reduce the amount of transactions in these cities by focusing just on the men, while making sure that you're doing everything you can, which of course we never do, to provide the education and the way out, et cetera, and the jobs for the women and girls who are being sold. So thank you all very, very much for coming. Thank you.